All right. Welcome back to Sociological Theory. Professor Grant. We're talking about queer studies, white fragility, and between the world and me. Okay. Queer studies by E. Patrick Johnson, or queer theory. I didn't give you all a reading for that, but I will post a reading if you're interested. But you don't have to read it because I didn't put it on your syllabus. But if you are interested in the topic, then feel free to take a glance at that. White fragility, interesting piece. Interesting piece there. So we'll talk a little bit about White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Between the World and Me, one of my favorite books. I would argue one of the most important texts in the 21st century, by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So I think we've talked about Ta-Nehisi Coates quite a bit throughout this semester. So we're going to delve a little bit more into this topic. First thing, sociological analysis paper is coming up. It's due soon. Some people have reached out to me about what they wanted to do their paper on and different things. So good. You can always ask questions. I'm always open for that. Yeah. So just know though that it's coming up real soon. Let me see. I think somebody reached out. I just remember. I think a student reached out to me. I think I forgot to respond. I can't remember about reading their paper. Ooh, okay, I'll try to remember so that I can make sure I respond to that email. I can't remember if I did. Okay, so first thing, queer versus queer theory. So we are talking about millennial identity with these topics, millennial identity. And we already talked about 20th century Black political thought. We've talked about post-civil rights sociology. So some of the things that have come up in terms of sociological theory. After the civil rights movement, which you start to see a big shift in the theoretical frameworks that become important and how people address things such as race, particularly race and class. So that's what we spent last class talking about. So this class, we are going to, for this section, we're going to talk about what people have said since the 2000s and some of the ideas and thoughts that have come up, particularly among generations that are seen as millennials, not necessarily people who are writing them as millennials, because E. Patrick Johnson wouldn't be considered a millennial. Ta-Nehisi Coates, maybe more closely. No, I don't even think he would be considered a millennial, or Robin DiAngelo for that matter. But the ideas that and the theories that they come up with are theories and ideas that are more in line with identity constructs that millennials, young people, I would be considered a millennial. You all might be considered post-millennial, but young people who became of age during the 2000s, during the millennial, those people who were teenagers in their 20s. So I was a teenager, I was in my 20s when the millennial started, or when the millennium started. The ideas that came up, that during that generation, the ideas or the theories that apply to that generation, new ideas around sexuality, new ideas around race, particularly new ideas around whiteness. And so that's where Robin DiAngelo's book comes in. I would say the oldest theory here probably is queer theory, which came about in 2001. I believe E. Patrick Johnson came up with that. We're going to talk about that in a second, around 2001. But even this notion of whiteness and white fragility is something that is fairly new came out. Robin DiAngelo wrote this, I believe, in 2015 or 2016. And then, but Between the World and Me was written in 2015, but it's a book that Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing to his son, who was born, I think it might have been born in like 2009 or 8 or 7, something. So all of this more so has to do with like these social ideas and theories that are starting to shape people of maybe my generation and after, right? So that's why I thought this would be good for millennial identity. So yeah, let's get into it. So queer versus queer theory. Now, queer theory is not new. Queer theory came about, I don't know the exact year, but it was definitely before the millennium. Ideas around queer and queer theory. And queer theory and queer politics, for the most part, so there's this larger idea around what queer theory is, and then it gets more nuanced and particularly applied to sexuality. But the larger idea basically says that queer theory and queer politics celebrate any transgression against the norm, any transgression against visible, in the form of visible differences from norms. So when you queer something, it doesn't necessarily have to mean something sexual. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that someone is gay or bi or pan or anything. Just to be queer is just to be different than the norm, or to be different than what people say is the norm. So you can be heterosexual and like or have a sexual attraction only to people of a different gender identity, and still be queer because of the way you dress, or because of the way you like to have sex, or because of the things you may eat, or because of your ideas. Anything that is not seen as normal, that is abnormal, is seen as queer, right? So that's the larger understanding of queer and queer theory. Now, to be more specific, while queer theory can be a site that is not necessarily determined by sexual practices, a lot of times when people discuss queer in both the academic and non-academic spaces in various points of discovery, right? Queerness and queer ideas are used to help us understand particularly sexual practices or sexual identities that are not directly in line with heterosexual normative behavior, right? Or what people consider heterosexual normative behavior. And so when we think about queer theory comes out of critical theory, or particularly the critical race theory that became popular. And we've talked about this before in the 1980s, and then queer studies came about in the 1990s. And most of the time when people talk about queer studies or queer theory, is usually looked at as gay and lesbian studies or studies around sexuality. Typically, you find it in women's studies programs or women's studies literature. But again, the term is very broad in its usage and can be associated outside of just gender and sexuality or gender and sexual practices, even that are oftentimes looked at as being alternative ideas outside of heterosexuality. And so queer theory challenges the ideas around heterosexuality being normal. So that is the idea. You can have queer theories inside of heterosexuality, but it just challenges this idea that heterosexuality is the norm, is the standard of behavior for anybody participating in sex or sexual practices. And so again, when we think about queerness and how queerness has derived, particularly within a contemporary setting, we see that the contemporary rise of queer theory has, while it has provided a certain level of freedom and given a certain level of power, looking at Foucault's work, power and knowledge, it has given a certain level of power to gender non-conforming. So when we say gender non-conforming, that's a word that was brought forth by an author. Her name, what's her name? Forgot. Sociology professor, I forgot. It's gonna come to me in a second. But this idea of gender non-conforming, meaning you do not conform to standard or normal ways of gender. Heterosexuality says gender. But gender non-conforming could be anything outside of heterosexuality, anything outside of cisgendered identity. And so this contemporary rise has provided a certain level of freedom for those groups, for those people. However, it has also been ignorant and dismissive of other racial groups and other class groups. What does this kind of sound like? What does this kind of sound like? This theory has been liberatory, if you will, for one group, but then dismisses the intersectionality of that group and tries to lump everybody into that group, even if they're of a different race, a different class. This reminds you a lot of what? Feminism, feminist theory. Remember? Feminist theory, very strong, very important in the women's rights movement, particularly around voting in the latter part of the 19th century. They came about again in the 1950s with Betty Friedan's work and the feminist mystique. All right? Came about again in the 1970s in the right for women to have control over their own bodies, the right to abortion, the right to get a credit card without a man. But one of the biggest issues with feminism and the feminist movement is what? They didn't include Black women. Black women's ideas and the issues that Black women faced were not as important. They said, listen, just get on the road to freeing women, and then your day will come. Black women also felt that way when fighting for Black people's rights in the civil rights movement. Don't worry about Black women's rights specifically, just get on board with the civil rights, the rights of all Black people, and you are included in that. And what Black women ended up finding was, didn't work well either. While there were some advantages, not as many advantages as there should have been for Black women, because they were always the scapegoat. They were always the ones that had to push their sacrifices to the side, what they needed to decide for the betterment of either their race or the betterment of their gender. Which is why Black women have created Black feminist thought, which is why Black women have expanded intersectionality, which is why Black women who created the Black Lives Matter movement said, we're not waiting for Black to address issues regarding Black women. We're gonna talk about it now. No more waiting. Same thing with queer theory. Queer theory talked about issues related to gay and lesbian and bi and pansexual, transgender people. But when you talk about Black and gay or Black and lesbian or poor and gay or poor and lesbian people, queer theory really didn't talk about that as much. They didn't address the race part. They didn't address the class part. Queer theorists usually, or at least early on in the 90s, they often argued that it was more of a reappropriation of a slur. We're taking power back. We're challenging dominant cultural norms by taking the power back. And that's not the first time this has been done in US society. There was a whole baseball team that is built off of a slur. Actually, a slur towards white people. Does anybody know the name of that baseball team? A very renowned baseball team. And it's the New York Yankees. Yankees was a slur. That was not a nice name to call somebody. If you call someone a Yankee, I want to say that was a southern term that was used towards Northerners. Calling them a Yankee was like kind of like, I guess, if a Northern person called a Southerner country. You know, you country bumpkin, y'all talk funny, y'all talk slow, ignorant, whatever, right? Yankee had that negative connotation as well. So that's not uncommon, right? Probably one of the more prominent examples is the use of the N-word by the Black community. For a long time, the use of the N-word was and still is a racial slur. It is not something that is allowed or accepted, and is seen as hate speech by anyone outside of the Black community. However, we see in music, we see in art, we see in language, and in your everyday discourse, Black people and certain people of color that may be non-Black, but may identify with Black culture or may be steeped in Black culture or accepted by Black culture, may use the N-word, right? And it is used as a way of, as a form of connection, as a form of empowerment. So we've seen certain books, right, by famous authors that have spoke on Black liberation and spoken on racial equality that have used the N-word, right? We've also seen it as a form of resistance by rap groups like NWA, N-words with attitude, using this language and this identity to speak out against police brutality in poor urban areas, right? So the N-word has been adopted by certain generations and certain people within the Black community as a form of gaining this power and bringing the power back to this word and saying, we're not going to let you take this word and use it against us. We're going to use it among ourselves for each other. And we know what it means when we say it to each other, and we feel okay with that. So there are these complexities, right, around language, right, around language and words. And it's the same way with queer. Calling someone queer in the 60s or 70s was absolutely derogatory. You could not say that word. It was very similar to saying the N-word, maybe even the 80s and some parts of the 90s. I remember the first time I was scrolling TV and I saw the term queer eye for the straight guy, or I saw that phrase. That was a show. I don't know if y'all remember that show, but that was a show in the early 2000s, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, where these gay men would help straight men dress better. It was a really good show. It was a really good show, and they had a certain fashion sense. I was like, wow, I need to learn that. I need to put those clothes together. I didn't have the money at the time. But queer eye for the straight guy. And I remember saying to myself, I thought it was a bad word. Like, I thought we couldn't say the word queer. But queer and the gay and lesbian population has now reclaimed that word as a form of empowerment, very similar to Yankees, very similar to the N-word, depending on your group, the group that you are a part of. And so queer theorists have argued that this is more of a challenge to the cultural norms, while at the same time it has ignored all of the other political and theoretical contributions that queer people of color have contributed to the struggle against queerphobia, to the struggle against what people call homophobia. And there are white queer theorists who have acknowledged that, who've said that there's this whiteness that exists in queer theory that shapes their own work, and that whiteness becomes the standard for queer theory. So queer is seen as this kind of inclusive idea, an inclusive identity, but like feminism, it has not always carried out that way. And Black gay men and Black lesbian women and Black trans and people of color who are trans or gay or lesbian have said, you know what, we're not seen in queer theory. You're not taking our experiences into consideration when discussing queer theory. And when discussing and talking about queer identity. And so that has been the problem with queer theory for a long time. And so because of that, the term queer theory has come up. The term queer theory was created by E. Patrick Johnson. We're going to talk about him a little bit more in a second, but queer theory uses the term queer and theorizes the racialized sexuality and how some parts of queer theory don't incorporate race. It doesn't incorporate the racialization of queerness. Okay. Sorry. Okay, there we go. And it answers the question, or it seeks to answer the question, which is interesting. How can we build queer theory from homophobic places? Can you get queer theory out of homophobic places? How can we rework these ideas to work for Black queer people or queer people of color? It's interesting, that question. How can we get, why do you want to get queer theory from places that are homophobic? It's like, how are we getting critical race theoretical ideas from spaces that are racist? Or feminist ideas from spaces that are sexist? But queer theory says, well, when you include race, and particularly when you're talking about Black people, you got to ask yourself that question. Because Black people exist in this very complex intersection of ideas and identities that are where Black people oftentimes have to pull from places because they are always in spaces of oppression. The further you go down, so if you're not just Black, but you're Black and you're a woman, so you're oppressed in race and gender, and then gay or lesbian, then sex, and then poor in class, and the further you go, so you're always around and in spaces that are not for you. So because of that, if you're a person of color, if you're a Black person, then you have to say, oh, I actually have to pull from these spaces in order to create my identity. I don't have a choice because I'm in it all the time anyway. Which is why, and for a lot of times, Black people or people of color, they have to pick their poison. I think we talked about this. We may have talked about it in this class last time. You have to pick your poison. So oftentimes, Black gay people find themselves in sacred spaces in one of their identities, but in toxic spaces in another one of their identities. If you know anything about Black people, particularly Black people from the South, a lot of them love church. Church is important. Church is where they can be themselves, where they can do those African rituals of call and response, talking back to the preacher, playing the drums, dancing in church, hearing gospel music, being able to be themselves in ways that they often cannot in predominantly white spaces. Church was a space of freedom and liberation for Black people since slavery. One of the first two institutions built, African institutions built since 1619 on American soil. Church, Black church and the Black family, according to the guy who wrote From Slavery to Freedom, John Hope Franklin. I think John Hope Franklin. So church is very important. At the same time, church can be a very, what people may consider homophobic space. Man must not lie with man, woman must not lie with woman. Homosexuality is a sin, blah, blah, blah. And so so then oftentimes Black queer people have to say, okay, well, what am I gonna, I love this space for my Blackness, but for my queerness, I'm not comfortable here. What do I do? I know the professor, Katie Acosta, Dr. Acosta, wrote an article, How Could You Do This to Me? She talks about the experiences of gender nonconforming Latina women who have come out to their parents, come out to their families. And she talks about how the family is a sacred space for Latina women. At the same time, oftentimes Latina mothers are the ones who are hardest on Latina women who decide that they're going to come out. So they're in this space where they love their mother. They want acceptance from their mother. At the same time, it is their mother that participates in what people consider homophobia by not accepting them and not accepting who they are. So people of color have to pull from these spaces in ways that oftentimes white people don't have to do. And this is where the term queer theory comes from. And queer theory makes up for, going to the next slide, makes up for what queer theory lacks. So it addresses the actual material, qualitative realities of people of color in the LGBTQIA+ community. It takes them into account. It is a sexuality application of intersectionality. Because again, what queer theory often fails to do is it fails to recognize how people of color theorists, non-white theorists, have contributed to queer theory, have challenged queer theory, and it ensures that the POC community and their contributions are accepted. Some people may ask, where does queer come from? Where do you get the term queer from? The actual term is a play off of what we call AAVE, African American Vernacular English. Some people say it's Ebonics. Some people call it Ebonics. But it's an actual English language, AAVE. Just like Patois. Just like Creole? Yeah, because you have French and then you have Creole. Right, you have Jamaican, I forgot what the other term is, but then it's Patois. You have the English language, Black English maybe, and then you have AAVE. I'm about to go to the store, right? AAVE. And then you actually spell it out like that. I'm about to, B-O-U-T, go to the store, S-T-O. And other forms of slang, Ebonics, that have now become part of the English lexicon. Bling bling. Just found out now that's a part of the English language, English lexicon. And the fact that it came out, I remember when Bling Bling came out, when Cash Money took over for the 99 in the 2000, and I was in ninth grade or something like that. So all that is now a part of African American Vernacular English, AAVE. And so queer theory comes from that. And the person, E. Patrick Johnson, created the term queer because he said he actually learned it from his grandmother. Because his grandmother, when she would talk about gay people, she said, ain't that boy queer? That's a queer little boy right there. And that's where he got the term. He said from his homophobic grandmother. And use that term as a way of talking about the Black gay experience, people of color, the experiences and the gay and lesbian experiences of people of color. So the term queer is an example of how Black gay people have had to go into homophobic spaces to find themselves and create an identity for themselves. And so queer theory does not just talk about all of these other identities, but then it creates identities. It gives language to identities. It gives language to Black gay, Black lesbian, Black bi, Black pan, Latino gay, Latina lesbian, bi, pan, trans. All of these different identities, queer theory gives rise to that. Oftentimes what you find with these theories is that it is out of the Black experience that pushes against the white marginalization or the marginalization of Black people in these larger white spaces of feminism and all that. Just like we talked about with feminism, you have Black feminism, you have womanism, and then out of womanism, womanism now says, my Latina sisters, create a form of womanism for yourself. My Native American sisters, create a form of womanism for yourself. My Asian American sisters, create one for yourself. And we also see that with queer theory. Black people have now said, no, we're going to create our own identity and then help to give rise to Latino and Latina queer people who can now create for themselves. Asian American, Asian queer people that can now create for themselves. And so we oftentimes see it happening in that way. Same way with the Black Power movement. And out of the Black Power movement, you have the Brown Power movement. You have the movement of Cesar Chavez. You have the Brown Panther Party in Chicago, the Chicano parties, the Chicano revolutions in Chicago and in California, mirroring the Black Panther Party. So it's very important that we learn from each other, that we empower, we understand our identities, and we empower each other. And so when we look at queerness and queer theory, it symbolizes this departure from the lack of engagement of not only race, but class. Queer theory is very classist. Oh, I didn't put up my other thing. Sorry, my filter. I had this other filter on the other one, then my computer died. Boom. Okay. Shout out. Okay. So I had this filter on there last time. I forgot I didn't have it. Since we're talking about queer and queer theory. So signals this departure from the lack of engagement with race and class by the queer theorists and with gender and sexuality among Black studies and scholars. So it basically says to the queer theorists, you all are not considering Blackness. And it tells the Black studies scholars, you all are not considering queerness. Queer theory is where they meet, where it tells the Black studies scholars, think about gender and sexuality, where it tells the queer theorists and queer scholars, think about our racial identity. And who's the first to do this? Good brother E. Patrick Johnson, born in 1967 in a small town called Hickory, North Carolina. He was I think the youngest of maybe 7 children raised by a single mother. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hickory, North Carolina. And later he would eventually go to college. He would get a Ph.D., speech communication and performance. And then he would become an assistant professor at Amherst College. And then later he would become a tenure track professor at Northwestern in Chicago, where he would eventually get tenure. And this is where he would introduce this idea of queer theory. And he introduced this notion by writing a book, not a book, an article called Queer Studies, or Almost Everything I Know About Queer Studies I Learned from My Grandmother. And this is where he brings in this idea that we need to go into homophobic spaces, or not we need to, but Black people have to, oftentimes, particularly Black queer people, have to gain their identity out of those homophobic spaces, or those spaces that may be oppressive in one way, but they're not in another way. E. Patrick Johnson loved his grandmother. His grandmother meant the world to him. But she was also homophobic. She was a person of her time. So he had to learn how to draw some of his queer identity from someone that he cared about. That's not uncommon for people of color who are gay, people of color who are lesbian, people of color who are gender nonconforming. And so when we think about queer theory and what E. Patrick Johnson does with queer theory, queer theory, we see that there is, in queer theory, there is this white sovereignty over the queer, Black, gay experience. Because people who are queer and people of color are accused of essentialism or anti-intellectualism. Essentialism falling in line with this idea that there is only this binary, or this natural way, this non-social constructionist way of thinking about sexuality. And when white sovereignty comes over queer theory and queerness, they often forget or ignore the racial side, and often ignore the strategic and purposeful adoption of cultural identity, which is important to queer survival. In other words, Black, gay, and lesbian people have to depend on their Black culture to survive homophobia. They pull from their Blackness to help them in their queerness. This is what E. Patrick Johnson is describing to us with queer theory. He says something. He says the homophobic elders must be drawn into the fight against it, because they give us knowledge on anti-sexism, on anti-racism. We learn how to fight by watching our elders fight racism and fight sexism. It's just that now we may have to fight them in some ways. Audre Lorde, we talked about Audre Lorde when we talked about Black feminism and womanism. Audre Lorde, powerful sister, powerful queer theorist. She says there is no liberation without community. Liberation cannot fall on the individual. There has to be community. I think she was specifically talking about people of color, more specifically Black people. because that definitely exists for Black people. You cannot have true liberation without some type of community. The civil rights movement couldn't have been successful with just Dr. King by himself. There had to be a community of people that bought into this idea. And it took a while. In fact, Dr. King, well, it's not an African studies class, Africana studies class, but if it was, we would go deep into that. But essentially, liberation cannot fall on the individual. Now, this is important because this dates back to the ideas of womanism, how that comes out of feminism in the 1980s. And one of the things that is the most important part of womanism is that while feminism looks at the white man as the enemy, as the sexist, as the misogynist, and says we have to fight against this to have what we need. Womanism says, yeah, but we can't do the same thing with our Black men. You could possibly fight against the white man, but you still have the privilege of being white. So you'll be all right. They still need you at some point. So they're going to work with you. We can't really see our Black men as the enemy. We can critique them. We can challenge them. We can even protest and boycott. But we can't see them as the enemy the same way that y'all do. Because we need Black men for the liberation of our race. This has to be a community effort. And so there is a certain acceptance of particularly Black men within the womanist space that does not exist for oftentimes for white women in the feminist space. Because Audre Lorde says we got to have a community for us. That's how it works for us. And so E. Patrick Johnson says we can challenge our homophobic elders. We cannot attend church. We can go against our uncles, our aunties who say certain things at the dinner table, at the Thanksgiving table that's coming up. Thanksgiving, some people call it Thanks-taking, because we know what happened during that holiday centuries ago. But they're saying we have to consider them to some degree if we want to really bring about liberation. They're a part of it. And so queer studies is a theory in the flesh. It focuses on how do we get queer theories. We focus on the lived qualitative experiences in this theory of the people within those groups. Queer studies interrogates the identity politics that exclude or excluding the allegiance of these isms of racism, of sexism. So it looks at performance and how performance is historically situated in identity. It looks at performativity. And performativity looks at or is focusing or focuses on the repetition of certain discursive acts. Certain acts of what is considered knowledge, what is considered behavior, both proper and queer, both normal and abnormal. And then the queers of color must look at these and then transgress responsibly. And if they don't, then their performances end up running the risk of reifying or reproducing the same oppressive realities that their mouths speak against. So this is essentially what queer theory does. This is a newer millennial identity that comes up in, out of research on probably my generation, younger scholars, bringing out these ideas, challenging these older ideas, or at the very least expanding on these older ideas, queer theory. So now we're going to go into white fragility. All right, so here we go. So before we get into our next topic, I want to ask a question. And I want you to think about what this means, right, to you. What does it mean if you identify as white? What does it mean to be white? Or how has being white shaped your life? How has being white shaped your life? And if you do not identify as white, how have white people shaped your life? How have white people shaped your life? And I don't want you to just give me the sociology answer. It doesn't just have to be, oh, because I've had privilege, blah, 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 blah. But you can be really honest. You're not writing this down. If we were in person, you know, we could talk about it. But just think about it if you want. How has being white shaped your life? Or how have white people shaped your life? And I can give an answer that is honest. I grew up in Jacksonville. I'm originally from Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I was born and raised. And I actually did not grow up a lot. I did not grow up around a lot of white people. I didn't know a lot of white people. Growing up, especially in my early years, everybody I knew was Black. My community was predominantly Black, more poor and working class. The church that I attended was all Black. There were no white people that went to our church. Everywhere that I went, it was always Black people. So I didn't see white people until I went to elementary school. And my mom and dad, now it would have been illegal, but at the time, they basically finagled me into being able to go to the school that was outside of my neighborhood. So that was my first time being around white people. And since then, the schools that I attended, I went to Darnell Cookman Middle School. I think it's called School of the Arts now or something like that. And then I went to Paxton School for Advanced Studies. And that's where I graduated from high school. And so those schools were predominantly white, but had some level of diversity. It would be considered, at least at that time, I'm not sure what it is now, but at that time, it would be probably more white. But there were Black people, there were Asian people, there were Latinx people, there were people of different groups. And then from there, I attended Florida. It was called FCCJ, Florida Community College. Now I think it's called Florida State College. And so in all of my experiences, then I ended up going to HBCUs, and then I graduated got my Ph.D. at a predominantly white institution. So I've had different varying experiences, been around different racial groups. Sometimes I'm the minority, sometimes I was the majority. And my experiences with white people, at least early on in my life, most of the time were either average or not that great. Whether it was a teacher or whether it was friends, well, not friends, but like classmates, things like that. It was rare that I would get these explicitly racist remarks. That was rare. Sometimes they did happen though from either teachers or classmates. But it wasn't like it happened every day, like some people may think about in maybe like a pre-civil rights era. But it definitely happened. But as I got older, I realized that white people looked at me differently, as opposed to me necessarily looking at them differently. So depending on where I was or what I've been through or what I had achieved or accomplished, that shifted. I saw a shift in the way that white people would then react to me. So I've had some negative experiences. I've also had some positive experiences. There have been some white people in my life that have helped me become the person that I am. And they were there to kind of help move me along. This typically happened in more of the latter part of my academic journey. It didn't happen much in Jacksonville or like with teachers or anything like that. That didn't happen much. I'm really trying to think, and I can't really think of that happening, like having a mentor. Now I did have a Mexican teacher. He was a mentor. He was great. And he actually inspired me a lot, but not many white teachers who did that kind of thing. But later on in my academic journey, I did have like white professors who helped me. I had white colleagues who helped me and provided me with opportunities. And definitely even now in my journey through a Ph.D., I have white colleagues who definitely helped put me in positions. So it became more positive as I got older, but early on, not so much. So that would be me answering that question, right? I guess it just depends on what part of life I'm in, whether it was positive or negative, or sometimes it just wasn't either. It was more indifferent. So that would be my answer. So just think about it. So what we're going to do in this next slide is we are going to talk about what's called white fragility. And we're going to look at the reading, talk about it. And I have some clips that I want us to look at, I want us to watch, and I want us to talk about as we're going through this, because these are some YouTube clips that I think really, really, really speak to what Robin DiAngelo is talking about in white fragility. So first thing, what is white fragility? So if we look on page 51, what is it? On that first page on the reading, and it says, and I will absolutely ask you this on an exam or something. What is white fragility? White fragility talks about how being white shapes our perspectives, experiences, and responses. White fragility helps us to understand how white people become so difficult in conversations about race. So when we ask, what is white fragility? Fragility itself is about how little it takes to set white people off. That's the fragility part. If somebody is fragile about something, that means when you talk about this particular thing, it sets them off. What's going on? Why would you do that? White fragility in this text talks about why when we discuss race, white people get sensitive. That's what Robin DiAngelo is asking. Robin DiAngelo is white, by the way. And so, and her line of race studies is whiteness. There's a line of race studies called whiteness. So if you're white or you're non-white and you're just interested in that line of race studies, then there's a whole set of literature for you. So how little it takes to set white people off is what we call fragility, particularly white fragility, and how we need to understand, or how being white shapes white people's perspectives, experiences, and responses. So then What does it mean to be white? And oftentimes it means to belong. It means to be a part of something, but guess what? And still be an individual. Because whiteness in the American context is based off of individualism. The US is based off of a lot of our laws, culture is based off of what? Individualism. I can do what I want. I have the freedom to be an individual. You have the Bill of Rights, which lays out these individual freedoms that early people who are considered to be forefathers and foremothers of the United States say we cannot infringe on these individual rights because we felt we were infringed upon by the British. So we can't infringe on these individual rights of our people. And that's how many Americans come, particularly white Americans, come into their lives. I'm an individual, I can do what I want. As long as I'm not hurting anybody. And to some degree, even if I do, depending on what it is, depending on what we're talking about, how much am I hurting them? And is it still going to be beneficial to me, i.e. slavery? Or how can I shape the narrative so that I'm not hurting someone, I'm hurting something, i.e. enslaved African people are considered to be things and property and not human beings. So whiteness is about individualism in the American context. And it tends to hold fast to this idea of merit. If I work hard, I can achieve success. So to lump white people into this idea of white fragility, it causes a lot of resistance because it causes white people to go against many white people to go against everything they've been taught. You mean just because I work hard, that doesn't ultimately mean that, or just because a person works hard doesn't ultimately mean they're going to be successful? No. Because there's a thing called privilege. It goes against everything they've been taught. It goes against what is often seen in the American literature and in their American history classes. That's why it's important to teach these things at a much younger age. So then when they get to college, oftentimes white students and sometimes even students of color aren't shocked. This should be taught at an earlier age so that they're not fragile. That could be it. That's an interesting part. I don't know if Robin DiAngelo gets into that as much, but that could be a solution for sure. So they're not as fragile when people bring up race or when people bring up slavery or when people bring up the not Oregon Trail, but the Trail of Tears, or when people bring up World War II. People bring up Hiroshima and Nagasaki and internment camps and all kinds of stuff. Also, when people bring up Pearl Harbor, people bring up 9/11. People bring up all of these ways in which things that can be linked to racial resistance or racial disharmony come up in conversation. It could just be a part of learning. And it doesn't have to hit people to a point where they're sensitive about it. So again, whiteness means to belong. So then how does Robin DiAngelo explain this in the text, this idea of belonging? How does she explain this in the text? Right? She talks a little bit about the fact that when you belong, it's not just that you're a part of a community, people see you as normal in that setting. You're normal in that setting. People don't assume that you're something else. And then she goes on to talk about how oftentimes Black people or Latinx people, when they're in certain settings, they're seen as being lower, or they're not appreciated, or they're not respected in the same way as if a white person was in that setting. Oftentimes people of color are seen as being the help, the janitor, the assistant. even if they are the person in charge, even if they own whatever it is that is there. So let's look at this clip. I want you to click on this first clip. I want you to tell me what happens in this, and then we'll come back. So you watched it. So what did you see? You saw this man, white man, and he's seems to be important, seems to know what he's talking about, speaking very confidently about whatever it is. He's talking to BBC News. So clearly he must know what he's talking about. And all of a sudden, this woman comes in and she's grabbing the kids. What's happening there? Who's that woman? Some people may say, oh, I don't know. Could have been his maid, probably, coming in. Some people say, oh, could have been his wife. I don't know. Somebody who came to visit his house. Let's click on that next link and start at 4 minutes and 26 seconds and then go to maybe about a minute and a half. Click on that link, start at about 4 minutes and 26 and then go about that long and then we'll come back. So you see that this was his wife. So this Asian woman coming in to get the kids were not just his kids, they were her kids as well. And so this tells us about belonging. Some people may argue because he's a white man, he belongs. Nobody's going to question his authority or if he owns the house or anything. He's white. He's good. But this Asian woman, she could be a wife, but she could also probably be the maid. And a lot of people thought she was the maid. Why? Because she's Asian. In fact, he was in an Asian country. That goes to show you how hegemonic whiteness is. You can be in a country where you're the minority and you're still seen as superior. A person that looks like you isn't even the president or the emperor or whatever. But whiteness is a powerful thing. Whiteness is power. You can be in a predominantly Black space. I say it to Black people all the time because I see it all the time. You can be in a Black space. And if a white person shows up, all those Black people will change their behaviors for the white person. Even if the white person doesn't tell them to do it or doesn't care. You have to watch what you say. You have to watch how you act. You have to make sure you don't say it. Make sure you don't, don't do that. There's white people here, but they're not even the majority right now. But that's because race and racism and all these things are intrinsically placed and forced and is hegemonic in everything we say and do. You have to consciously fight against it. All people, white people, people of color, all people. So this woman says, no, I'm not his maid. This is my husband. They're on the same level. But that's what belonging is. Whiteness is belonging. Whiteness is always looking like you belong, even if you don't, or treated as if you belong, even if you don't. Which kind of goes into this next notion of the freedom from the burden of race. And the freedom from the burden of race. Let's look at that. Robin DiAngelo says, because I haven't been socialized, going to that section, that first paragraph on that section, because I haven't been socialized to see myself or to be seen by other whites in racial terms, I don't carry the psychic weight of race. I don't have to worry about how others feel about my race, nor do I worry that my race will be held against me. While I may feel unease in an upper class environment, I will take for granted that I belong racially in those settings. I certainly will not be the only white person there unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. George Zimmerman would not have stopped me as I walked through a gated suburban neighborhood. So there's this burden of race where people of color often wonder, am I going to be the only one there? Black people ask themselves a question all the time. How many black people are going to be there? Or how many white people are going to be there? Or is this a diverse place? All may not, but a lot of us do. Right? But that is something that comes up among conversations with people of color. And white, at least according to Robin DiAngelo, white people don't really ask themselves that question that much. How many white people are going to be there? Or is it going to be diverse? Because there's just this automatic assumption that I don't really have to think about my race like that. Because my race is what? Normal. I belong wherever I'm going. Not to say there may not be some level of singularity, right? If you have a white person in a predominantly black setting, maybe a predominantly black church or a predominantly black college and university or whatever, you may get a few looks, but very rarely would there be anything intense, right? Also, with the freedom from the burden of race, there is not this idea that whatever I have, I earn. Because people of color oftentimes wonder, did I get where I am because of my race? Did they only hire me because they needed a black person? Do my stats really, really matter here? Does what I bring to the table really matter? Or is it just because of my race? And Robin DiAngelo is saying white people don't really have to think about that. They just kind of, Not to say white people don't deal with what they call imposter syndrome. Everybody deals with imposter syndrome, but not in terms of race. It's more so in terms of, ooh, now how can I live up to whatever is expected of me? And I don't know if that is racialized. That's probably more of a psychology question. If you have a psychology class, you'll know more about that than I would. Okay. Then we move on to freedom of movement. She has a section called freedom of movement. So my question is there any place or space in America that a white person can go where they will not be respected and or protected? Do you think white people can go anywhere and not be respected and or protected? Some people may say, yeah. Yeah. Let's say, for example, you go to the basketball court and it's a bunch of black guys on the basketball court. And then the white guy shows up with his basketball. First thing you may hear, if we're honest, what this white boy doing on the court? He don't know how to ball. He can't play ball. Or maybe he can, or he wouldn't come up here if he couldn't. Let's see. So there may be, because of these stereotypes, right? These ideas around blackness, basketball, it's a black sport, blah, blah, blah. Black people can play basketball. Not to say white people can, there's a lot of white NBA players, but is this initial kind of, let's test it. If it was a black person, they would look like they belong. If a black person walked up on that court, they would automatically assume to be able to play until they show they can. With the white person, it's the opposite. That person probably can't play. Let me check and see. Let me just play some defense just to see. Oh, he just hit 3 threes in a row. Oh, okay, he can play. Let me see what he does here. Let me play him up close. Oh, he can dribble. Oh, okay. This white guy can play. Right? So there is some people may say, see, he's not being respected there. Well, there's no really disrespect, but there is a certain level of stereotypes happening, absolutely, for sure. Stereotypes, prejudice, I guess, if you want to use that term. But not really any disrespect. And the key to that question isn't necessarily the disrespect part, because there are absolutely places where white people can go where they may not be respected or they may be mistreated. It's not to say if a white person goes to every Black event or Black organization or anything with people of color, there are disrespectful people in all groups. So somebody may disrespect them. But the protected part is the different part. Because the argument is, if we look at like Jim Crow State of Mind, which is another article published by a doctor in sociology, Spatializing Blackness by Rashad Shabazz, would tell you, absolutely, white people can go anywhere in this country and be protected. Doesn't mean white people won't get hurt or even pass away, but they have a system. There is a law enforcement system. There is a criminal justice system that will go above and beyond to, if something does happen to a white person, they will receive justice. So either there is a protection of their body or there is a protection of their legacy or their story. It's very rare that won't happen. So white people have this kind of freedom of movement to be any and everywhere and be mostly respected and always protected. Either their protection of their body, if the police show up, the likelihood that a white person will be protected increases, and a person of color, not so much, particularly Black and Latino people. Also, white solidarity. What is white solidarity? Let's look down on page 57. White solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. Meaning, you're white, you hear a white person say something that's not good, that's racist, and you say nothing. You say nothing. You may actually experience this in another week or so when you go to Thanksgiving dinner. And you may hear a cousin or a grandmother or a mother or a father or an uncle or whoever say something at the dinner table. Say something racist. Or at the very least, something that is racially insensitive. You may participate in white solidarity. You may not say anything. Why? Because you want to, at least in public, show that you have this solidarity, you are connected to them via whiteness. You don't want them to look at you as having more loyalty to a racial group that you're not even connected to. So you have to show this white solidarity. Happens with men all the time. Men are constantly around other men, and they may say something very negative about women, call women out of their names, derogatory names. And they may not do it, but they won't say anything. Why? Because they don't want to look, I don't want to look soft in front of boys, and I don't want to look like I'm like all feminine and all that. I mean, I don't think you should call women the B word or the H word, but man, that's just them. I just let them do their thing. Well, I'm not racist, but I know my grandmother, she says things and she's just from a different time. but I love my grandmother. I don't really want to say anything. I just let her just believe what she want to believe. That's white solidarity. And white people participate in that. And that is a way of silently still reinforcing racism by staying quiet. And oftentimes what we find with people who are the ones who are kind of helping other people participate in white solidarity, these people have this idea about the good old days. The good old days. The good old days says, as a white person, I can openly and unabashedly reminisce about the good old days, romanticize recollections of the past, and calls for a return to former ways, a function of white privilege, which manifests itself in the ability to remain oblivious to our racial history. Claiming that the past was socially better than the present is also a hallmark of white supremacy. Man, I wish we can go back to, we can go back to those days when things were this way. You may hear your grandparents say, man, those were the good old days. Were they good? You sure? For everybody? I don't know. Maybe for people that look like you, they were great. Maybe for people that look like other people, not so much. I want you to click on this link to look at how this idea of the good old days has been politicized. It's been brought into our politics, brought into our American politics. Click on that link. And then when you come back, we'll talk about it. So it's interesting. Trevor Noah's people's out there and they're saying, make America great again. Make America great again. Okay, well then that means it was great once before. When was it great? Some people say when our forefathers wrote down in the Constitution, everybody should be treated equally. Yeah. Sounds like a great time. If you don't consider the fact that those same forefathers, when they went home that night to go get something to eat, there was a Black woman bringing it to them that was considered to be not a person, or a Black man who was still working, picking their cotton or their rice or their whatever, corn, and they weren't being paid. When was America great? Oh, America was great when we gave women women's rights. Well, Black women still didn't have rights at that time. The Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 50 years after that. The Voting Rights Act for everybody wasn't passed until 50 years after that. Was it really great? Make America great again. When was it great? Well, the first time that slogan became significant was in 1980s with Ronald Reagan. Was that when America was great? Some people may say, yeah. That was also the height of mass incarceration. That was also when racialized incarceration went from 40,000, and it was at the height in the 80s, and ended up being at about 400,000, 500,000, almost 500,000, with 60 to 70% of them being people of color. Particularly, at that point, people of color. So when was America great? That would be the question. Obviously, there's some funny, there's some comedy kind of, but it's a real question. And it's part of what Robin DiAngelo was saying of the good old days. When we talk about the good old days, whiteness allows white people to look back at certain days as being good, when in reality, they weren't good for everyone. So white fragility is a very, and it's a whole book, but this is just one piece of it. But it's a very good text that gets at this new studies new studies of whiteness. Something that was really first addressed, usually by Du Bois. By Du Bois in Darkwater, Souls of White Folk. He was really the first person to really look at whiteness, was a Black man. But this idea of white fragility is something that's very new among this millennial identity, among more millennial scholars. So that's why I think it's very important now that we're moving into more present day sociological theory that we talk a little bit about not only queer theory, but also whiteness. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm going to insert a piece of a lecture that it's the same thing that talks about this, that I feel like really addresses everything about this topic Between the World and Me. So I'm going to insert that lecture here. And then after that, you're done. Make sure you're taking notes. You're taking notes on all of this stuff because it will be on your exam. And make sure you're working on your paper. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Your paper is due very soon. So make sure you look at your syllabus so that you know when your paper is due. No exceptions, no extensions. I'll be working on it. All right. But I always, if you have questions or if you want me to read over it, let me know. I think I have to read over a student. So let me go look at that. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. And see you soon. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. Man, I really, really, really hope that you participated in this reading. Hold on, let me make sure. Let me go grab it real quick because we're going to be going through this text. Okay, so Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Absolutely by far one of the most important books of the 21st century, by far. If you have not read it, whether you're in sociology or not, if you're just a person who is building your library, if you like the things that we've been discussing, if you just want good reading, absolutely. As you can see, already, #1 New York bestseller, even though that's not really, that is saying a lot, but it's a lot of books that said here, the #1 New York bestseller. But this one really should be. It's, definitely one of the most important texts. And if you were in my sociological theory class, we talked about this as it pertains to The Fire Next Time, which absolutely is one of the most important books of the 20th century. So a lot of people have equated this text as the second coming of The Fire Next Time and looked at Ta-Nehisi Coates as almost the second coming of James Baldwin. Okay. Anyway, what is Between the World and Me about after you read it? What is it about to you? Okay. What is it about to you? To me, Between the World and Me is a book that Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing to his son. Very similarly to James Baldwin, who writes The Fire Next Time, a series of letters, really mainly 2 letters that he breaks up into 2 sections of the book that he's writing to his nephew. And it's published in 1963. And it takes on, I'm talking about that and I'm gonna come to Ta-Nehisi Coates. It takes on the ideas of race in America and puts it in a way to where this uncle is teaching his son, or this uncle is teaching his nephew about how to navigate race in 1960s America. Preferably as it comes to the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, I said it was published in 1963, the Emancipation Proclamation, the document that was said to end slavery. It really didn't, but it was said to, was passed in 1863. So it is a letter that James Baldwin is actually writing to his nephew to teach him about this world that he's getting ready to be a part of. Powerful, powerful, powerful book. And an incredible analysis of race. I don't agree with, I don't want to say a lot, but some significant points that Baldwin brings out, but still very important. Very important. And maybe if I lived during that time, I probably would have agreed. Who knows? But living in a post-Black Power, post-civil rights, Black Lives Matter era, it's kind of like, But this text, very, very similar. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a father. He has a son. I think his son was maybe about 9 or 10 when he maybe started writing this book, or either when it was published. And this is a book to his son. And he's talking to his son about race in present day America. Interestingly enough, though, I think he might have been in Paris when he was writing it, because I know he had I think a fellowship or something, and he got paid a lot of money to just kind of sit and write. So that's definitely his class advantage there. But he worked hard for that class advantage because he did not come from upper class status. Ta-Nehisi Coates was born and raised in a lower middle class, working class family in Baltimore. He was born, he was raised in Baltimore in the 70s, maybe the 1970s and 80s. He was there around the onset of hip hop. So if you read this book, hip hop plays a huge role in how he understands life. Rap music plays a big role in how he understands his position in the city as a Black man in America. He also comes up during the crack epidemic. So he sees drugs, he sees drug dealers, drugs play an influence in his community. He later goes on to attend Howard University. He loves Howard University. In fact, now he's a professor at Howard University. Howard University is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C., and he calls it the Mecca. He is a huge Howard University fan. He does not graduate. He eventually drops out of college and pursues his dreams of being a writer. And it takes him a while to get there, but he does eventually get there. And by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I want to say he was the editor of the college magazine or college newspaper, if I'm not mistaken, and a very, very, very proud product of Howard University. And the way in which he writes, his eloquence, his delivery, his knowledge of history, his knowledge of books, his knowledge of literature far exceeds many people who probably did graduate from Howard University. His stories of friends who have been killed by the police, or friends who have been arrested, or situations that have occurred in his life that helps him make sense of race in America. He's now translating these ideas into a letter to his son. A phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal text. Unlike James Baldwin's Fire Next Time, his analysis does not end with hope. His analysis more so ends with the idea that, you know what, son, James Baldwin ends the Fire Next Time saying, I believe in hope for America. I believe if we can appeal to white people and appeal to the consciousness and educate them and help them understand that things are going to be better. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says, son, it's just the way it is. And I don't know if it's going to ever change. I don't think so. Right? So there is this bitter reality. There is this truthfulness. There's this transparency of the world in which we live from the perspective of a young Black, of a older Black male to his son, and helping him to prepare for this world to come. So is this between the world and me, well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, is this between the world and me that he's talking about, between my world and then my son's world. But then it's also between the world and me, this white world and this Black world that he is kind of dealing with all at the same time. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. If you get a chance, definitely do the reading for the class, but you should also do the reading for you should also, if there was any book I would say you should check out from this class, this will absolutely be one of them in its entirety. So Between the World and Me is essentially what is, that is what it is about. Also, if we go to page 7, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I want you to look at the paragraph that says, but race. He says, but race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy. I can't even pronounce that word. I meant to do it before I came on here. Physiognomy. So much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, this is the new idea at the heart of these new people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. So he says race is the child of racism, not the father. What does that mean? What is he suggesting here? My thoughts are that he's saying racism came first, and then race was used to support racism. Racism is the belief that people should be placed on a hierarchy based on these attributes that we call race: skin color and hair and nose size, lip size, culture. All these things play a role in how intelligent or how intelligent or how righteous or how moral someone is. But the system was created first, and then race and the names and the context and the meanings and the policies and the institutions and the art that were connected to race came afterwards. Racism was the idea of the slave trade, was the idea of the transatlantic slave trade. Because actually, to be fair, and my argument would be capitalism preceded both of those. Essentially, and did we go here in this class? The short history of race. I think we read that in this class. I think we did. We talked about the fact that initially there was no such thing as race. And when the transatlantic slave trade happened, it was really all for money. It wasn't that people first started to dislike Black people or African people. White people didn't have a problem. Europeans didn't have a problem with Africans. In fact, a lot of Europeans looked up to Africans because they knew the stories of Egypt. They knew the stories of Ethiopia. They knew how much gold and resources were on the continent. They liked the fact that they had this amazing military. They had no problem with Africans. But the expansion of greed and the need for labor and the need for labor with a distinct coloration, a distinct skin coloration was necessary. Started with European immigrants, then they went to Native Americans, and that didn't work. Long story. So then and actually it was a Spanish explorer who later regretted what he said, but he encouraged them to no longer enslave the Native Americans, say you should actually go over there and get those Africans. They're dark skinned, they don't know the land, they don't know this land, but they know the land. They know how to plow, they know farming, they can survive in the southern region. You should go get them. So it had less to do with race and more to do with economics. They were just the better labor choice, if you will. So that's my argument. Ta-Nehisi Coates goes on to say, then there was the creation of racism. So we have to find a way to justify subjugating these people. We create racism, and then we find a way of subjugating it by creating race. We'll call these people Black. We have to call us something else, so we'll call us white. And then we have to attach meaning to this based on their skull size, based on their culture. These people come from the jungle. The ham in the Bible was cursed. All these different meanings and reasons that would suggest Black means X, white means X. That's my interpretation of what he means when he says race is the child of racism. The subjugation in the system was created first, and then you had to create meaning that went alongside race. And so then, as we move forward in the reading, he goes on to say, or he goes on to talk about some of the things that are going on. This was published in 2015. So he goes on to talk about on page 8 and 9, he talks about some of the same people we just discussed. Eric Garner, who was choked out in New York for selling cigarettes. Renisha McBride, who was shot for seeking help when her car broke down. Another Black woman who was brutally murdered. John Crawford, who was shot for browsing in a department store. Tamir Rice, he was 12 years old, outside playing with a gun, and the police pulled up at a park. He was playing with a toy gun, and the police pulled up at a park and shot him dead. And in all these situations, I don't think any police officers or anybody saw any jail time. So what is going on in American history that Coates is using to frame his discussion on race? The Black Lives Matter movement. Exactly the same way in which James Baldwin used the civil rights movement to address his nephew and explain to him the world he's getting ready to go into. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, son, this is the world you're getting ready to go into. Let me tell you what's happening around you. Let me tell you what's happening to people that look like you. And he is using this moment in American history to warn his son and to prepare his son for this world. You live in a world and they live in a world. And your world has to navigate the world in a different way that their world does. So this is what's going on in American history that is causing Coates to have this conversation with his son. And then on page 12, let's look at page 12. The part that I really like, so you see a picture of him and his son on page 13. Page 12, if we go down to the middle part of that paragraph, he says, how do I live free in this Black body? It is a profound question because America understands itself as God's handiwork, but the Black body is the clearest evidence that America is the work of men. What does that mean? It's powerful. Very, very powerful. What is he saying here? If we look at things like what's called manifest destiny, certain documents within US history, there's this idea that God has blessed America. That God has looked upon America and has blessed this country with freedom, with democracy, with the opportunity to show the world that there can be a place that can live without oppression, without tyranny, to show that people can live in harmony and peacefully, and that if a person works hard, they can achieve great success just from their merits. That is the idea of America. That is part of the American principles. What Bonilla Silva would call abstract liberalism. These abstract ideas of the American philosophy, what Barack Obama would call the American experiment. But Ta-Nehisi Coates says, but Black people say that, so according to white people, particularly white middle-class people, would suggest that America is God's handiwork. God created this beautiful country to show the rest of the world how humans should behave. But Black people in America, is evident that God did not create this country. Man created this country. Because what man creates, inequality follows. America's not the first country to have inequality. Inequality has been existing since the world exists. It's just that America's no different. And so to the white body, America's God's handiwork. But to the Black body, America is the work of men. Because Black people remind America, Black people remind the United States, Black people remind this world that it is absolutely flawed at its core. It is a flawed place, it is a flawed space, and it is a place that exists for the betterment of certain groups, of certain people. Which again goes back to the title of the text. There is a different world that exists between you and me. We embody this world, and then there is another world. There is one world where people believe that America is God's handiwork, and there is our world that reminds them that it is not. And so then if we go to pages, so then he goes on, if we go to page 20 and 21, I really wanted to talk there. This is where he goes deeper into this notion of these two worlds. Remember, he's talking about between the world and me as an older Black man, and I've navigated and I am navigating this world. So I have my world, and then I'm talking to you world, which again, going back to the hip hop references, there's a famous song by an early hip hop pioneer called Hey Young World by Slick Rick, for those who may be hip hop historians. Hey Young World is a very popular rap song, came out in the 1980s or early 1990s. So he could also be playing along that, where Slick Rick is talking to the younger generation and talking to them about how to be better, how to improve their lifestyle, and how to be positive contributors to society. So this notion of world and people, right, is what Ta-Nehisi Coates is playing on. Then he goes on in page 20, about halfway down, and says, he says, there were little white boys with complete collection. No, I'm sorry. Let me go back one sentence. He says, in the evenings, I would sit before this television, bearing witness to the dispatches from this other world. There were little white boys with complete collections of football cards, and their only want was a popular girlfriend, and their only worry was poison oak. That other world was suburban and endless, organized around pot roasts, blueberry pies, fireworks, ice cream, sundaes, immaculate bathrooms, and small toy trucks that were loose in wooded backyards with streams and glens. Comparing these dispatches with the facts of my native world, I came to understand that my country was a galaxy, and this galaxy stretched from the pandemonium of West Baltimore to the happy hunting grounds of Mr. Belvedere. I obsessed over the distance between the other sector of space and my own. I knew that my portion of the American galaxy, where bodies were enslaved by tenacious gravity, was Black, and that the other liberated portion was not. I knew that some inscrutable energy preserved the breach I felt, but did not yet understand the relation between that other world and me. And I felt in this a cosmic injustice, a profound cruelty, which infused an abiding, irrepressible desire to unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape. Very beautifully written. Poetic, if you will. What does this mean to you? What do you take away from this passage? How do you summarize the meaning of that text? I will give you my suggestion, but I think it's a good way to end with your thoughts, because that's a very important section. And it's there that he takes you into his analysis. So think through that. You don't have to write that down. You don't have to send it to me, but think about it. Reread it if you have to. Thank you.